Hello, and welcome to Deconstructing History, the podcast where we talk about all things living history and reenacting. I am your host, Mike Baker. On today's episode, we have historian and living history interpreter Marvin-Alonzo Greer, also known online as Mag the Historian. Marvin is the lead historic interpretation and community engagement officer for the Maryland National Capital Parks and Planning Commission. He's also well known in living history circles for his interpretation of Black history. He's also a trained historian with degree in history from Morehouse College, as well as a specialist in African American history. I also consider him easily in my top 10 list of living history interpreters. And now on to the show. One of the reasons why I think you're in my top 10 for living history portrayers is because you are a trained historian, and so you bring the craft, the historian's craft, into living history. But what came first for you, sort of being the historian, the love of history, or living history and reenacting?
I would say that my love of history came first. I was fortunate enough to have parents, especially my dad, who was really interested in history, and then my grandparents, mainly my grandmother, on my maternal grandmother, was very interested in genealogy and family history. And then my maternal grandfather, his oldest sister, my Aunt Eunice, she was a librarian and also kind of a family historian and genealogist. And so definitely coming from my mom's side, I had a lot of elders that kept family history, kept family records. And so from a very young age, my grandparents, my grandmother, my grandfather on my maternal side, again, they would drive from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to Pasadena, California, where I'm originally from. And they would drive us across the Southwest. We would stop in every state, hit every national park, any museum, we would stop there. Whether it was nature or history, we did it. And I think my grandparents just really instilled that love. For me, they instilled a love of exploring our nation's history and culture, and not just what we learn about in our textbooks. We stopped at Native American historical sites. We stopped at reservations and met people and talked, and like we would they tried to eat in restaurants or diners that were run or owned by Native people. And then we would stop at obviously bigger things like the Grand Canyon. And along the way, when we were driving, my grandmother would, obviously this is the day before cell phones, so she would carry pictures of her family, her parents and her grandparents, and she would show us these pictures in the car, and because they had a huge van, and of course these days before like child safety, so we were definitely like kids, like out of our seatbelts, just sitting on the floor, and in like the late 80s, early 90s. And so she would show us these pictures, and I would spend hours looking at the faces of like my great grandfather, my great grandmother, and asking her questions. My grandmother was this amazing storyteller, so she would tell me these stories of my family. And we'd go to all the different family sites in Georgia and South Carolina and Virginia and Maryland, and we would end up in Pittsburgh, where obviously my grandmother had even more photos and more documents. I just loved hearing her stories, and just even when she wasn't around, I would sneak into the room where she had these images, and I would just like look at these pictures. And then her neighbor, a woman who adopted me as a grandson, her name was Dorothy Lee, or Aunt Dot, as I called her. She didn't have any grandkids, and she also she was lonely, she was a widow, and I used to go over to her house when I was staying at my grandparents' house and just spend time with her. And I loved her house because her husband served in World War II, and I believe he was an officer, African-American officer in World War II. And he had passed away in like 1996, and so I never met him. But she always had his uniforms like hanging up and different things like things from the world. They traveled around the world apparently in like the 50s and 60s. So she had things from China, and uh, I remember she had like art from Spain and all around the world. And every summer when I would come, she'd give me one artifact. Sometimes it would be a whole uniform of her husband's. I still have it in my closet now, his military uniform. Other times it might be a hat from one of their travels. And so I think that exposure from my elders, from my grandparents, from my aunts and uncles, and hearing these stories really inspired my love of history. But that was not what I wanted to be when I was in college, at least initially. Eventually, it changed into being a history major.
Would you say your grandmother's love of storytelling kind of rubbed off on you into going into something like historic interpretation and the programming?
I think so. Initially, when I became so, I started doing reenacting in middle school. I think like eighth or ninth grade, and then maybe seventh. It's been a long time, so I don't really get. I don't think 11 or 12. So however long that is. So I think I was like 12 when I got into reenacting, and then at the time I really didn't care too much about interpretation. I was a child, so I just was really obsessed with like the horses, the guns, and the cannons. That was really really cool. And so it wasn't really until I got to college and started doing my classwork. My grandmother passed away while I was in college, but I was working. I started working at the Atlanta History Center as a museum educator, and between and seeing the difference between what I was doing in the workplace and what I was doing as a hobby of reenacting, it just was so vastly different. Reenacting was people dressing up in costumes and playing war, the same thing that I did when I was a kid, playing war, being soldier. And I wanted to do more. My grandmother did like the thought of my grandmother did always speak to her spirits always with me. And I think wanting to do honor to her, wanting to do honor to the ancestors that came before us, and accurately tell those stories. I was when I was reenacting, I found that I was one of very few African Americans or people of color in general on the reenacting field. There was very little time for education. There was very little time to talk to the public. It was kind of like an add-on, like if you came to see the battle, but if you wanted to go and walk a mile or two to the camp, which was always far away from where the spectators would be, then you could. And then there it was very like guys were hanging out, drinking beer, and doing whatever. Their job was not to interpret to the public. And so I just really fell in love with this idea of telling the story of people who were left out of the historical narrative, people who were left out of invitations to Civil War reenactments and reenactments of other time periods. And then I really transformed into going from reenacting and doing fewer and fewer reenactments into being more of a living historian and historical interpreter. So I feel that when I'm being paid and doing it for a living, I'm a historical interpreter, and then if I'm volunteering my time, I usually say I'm doing a living history. And I think that was definitely inspired by my grandmother, because I think her spirit was like, "You're wasting your time out here playing soldier." But I also it was that knowledge and the experience of reenacting. There are times where I do attend reenactments still, but I don't.
Yeah, I remember you writing something to the point of there's a difference between living history and reenacting. I consider reenacting along the lines of like historical cosplay is how I best describe it. And then living history is sort of that public history. And so would you say that your background in history, I do remember you do have your degree in history.
Yes.
If I remember correctly. Does that sort of help push what you're doing?
I would say that reenacting got me into, my love of history kind of took me into being a scholar, majoring in history and wanting to do more research. I I remember I'll admit, I was a product of the lost cause mythology. I grew up in the American school system. And I remember my mom got me a book. It's probably somewhere on my bookshelf here. Um, of like something on Black Confederates because one of her friends like recommended it. They didn't know any better. But I loved this book as a kid. I even corresponded via email with Charles Kelly Barrow, he was the former, they don't call him the Grand Wizard, but like the former head of the Sons of Confederate Veterans who like wrote this book. And I remember corresponding with him like as a kid via email, and he tried to like give me all this propaganda. And for a while, I fed into it until I really started reading those primary sources when I got to college and was challenged in those undergraduate classes of like you can't use secondary source. What is primary source? And having to go and look at these documents and be like, oh wow, these people were lying to me. Authors that I thought I could trust and apparently could not. So I think that kind of helped that steer me in that way.
Last episode, we had Dr. Erica Briesacker, who was talking about public history and this idea that people will reenact for various purposes, whether, you may have Confederate reenactors who are doing it to sort of fill some kind of hole in them because of history, or the lost cause myth may push them along. What's interesting is being in New England and with New England reenactors, we have a lot of Confederate reenactors who have no connection to the historical Confederacy. A lot of them have no ancestors who fought in the Confederacy, but I say they use Confederate reenacting to kind of take sort of neoliberal ideals and sort of classic liberal ideals, sort of these conservative ideologies, and kind of bring it to the hobby, small governments thing. And so they're able to sort of express these sort of ideals even in reenacting. And, there's other reasons people reenact. And I guess talking about what drives reenactors and living historians and why we do what we do in the portrayals, what drives you to sort of do these living history portrayals, and what inspires you?
What drives me is duty to ancestors, because I am the descendant of enslaved people and enslavers. The furthest I can go back in my family history is to the pre-America, when we were still colonies, and I had an ancestor who served under Washington. He was in the Continental Militia in Virginia and in North Carolina. He was white. I'm pretty sure he was an enslaver of people, and his son never legally married, and never married a white woman, and had a relationship with his enslaved woman named Susan, and I'm a product of that relationship. And as I've done more family history and research, people like Susan, people like her children. She had a son named David, Alex, Sophie. My ancestors just weren't in the history books growing up as a kid. I remember like as a elementary, middle, high school, maybe high school, my teachers were a little bit better, but elementary and middle school, definitely it was very white, Eurocentric. And I didn't see people who looked like me in the historical narrative. And so when I interpret, I want to make sure that if there's any other little Black boys, little Black girls, or any other child of color, because I don't stop my research at just Black people or people of African descent. I try to be well versed in Asian American history, in Jewish American history, in Native American history. And I don't necessarily need to be the best expert on that, but at least if I see someone who fits that demographic, if I hear someone speaking Spanish and I can tell that they are from South Central America or the Caribbean, I can ask them where they're from and then say, hey, did you know that, and name off a person or name off a battle that we know that the people that are Latinx or that are Asian participated in. because BIPOC people are left by the historical narrative, and I think that is really really drives me to make sure that we are showing the diversity that America has always been. Not this modern day idea that many conservatives tout that it's only until the 20th century we start getting this influx of immigrants to the country that were not from Europe. But Asian Americans have been here since pre-colonial day, since the colonial times. People from South Central America have been here. Obviously, many of them were of native descent or indigenous people, and so they obviously this is their land as well. And then there was trade, obviously, from the Caribbean going back and forth, and obviously Africans are being brought to the Caribbean, which make islands like Jamaica today. Most of the people don't have ancestry that goes back to the indigenous people. However, we can still talk about those complex issues of immigration, of slavery, comparing and contrasting enslavement in the Caribbean to the United States, and then also looking at the different cultures that developed. Why is Jamaican culture so much different than culture in New Orleans? Why does New Orleans have a more similar culture to Haiti? But Haiti has a very much different culture than the Gullah people from Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Florida. And so really talk about these different infusions of African identities into these different locations and how those make those locations unique and strong, and that they're not speaking broken English or broken French or broken Spanish, but they are developing unique cultures and making these African communities making the way out of place. So that's really what drives. I do think that there are people who, especially people of a more conservative bend. I'm not saying that all conservatives who do living history and reenacting are this way, but in my experience, many people that I've met are living out fantasies where they're doing Civil War, American Revolution, definitely in World War II reenacting. It gets real weird. People doing German and SS, and I think that people should really seek some mental health counseling. Not saying you need to stop what you're doing altogether, but to really address and unpack why you do what you do. Are you doing it because you just like the uniforms? Because uniforms have meaning. Everything we put on has a symbol. The clothes that I'm wearing today, the clothes you're wearing today, we picked those out when we went to the store. We're wearing them today because they express something about ourselves. We don't necessarily just randomly walk into a store or close our eyes and start hitting buttons on the computer to order something to come to our house. The clothes that we wear are symbols. They tell you something about the wearer. And the same thing is when it comes to living history and reenacting. This is an option. We choose to do these impressions. We choose to make these choices. We choose which side we want to portray. And that's not to say that we need to stop representing Confederates altogether. But being honest with why you're doing the impression you're doing. Are you doing it because you want to honor your Confederate ancestor? Okay, cool. Do you? Also be honest with the interpretation of your Confederate. Are you doing this because you have no Confederate ancestor, but you secretly wish for the good old days? Maybe you may not want slavery, but you don't like Black Lives Matter. You want to have this. You really like this idea of small government, where the Confederacy and that idea the Confederacy stood for, which they did not. And so I think really trying to challenge people to unpack why they do the impressions they do, or they have the preferences for the impressions they do. So I think that's really, really important.
And yeah, I think that may be one of the big differences between reenactors and living historians or living history interpreters is reenactors sometimes don't interrogate why they do what they do, but they don't interrogate the sources at all, and they do take things, I think, at face value in a way. Not saying all reenactors, but some do that, and that is why I think, and I think it's something you said before, that all living history interpreters can reenact, but not all reenactors can do living history interpretation. Because of that interrogation. Why do we do the things that we do? And going back to something you said about the fantasy, and I think connecting it to Black living history, Black reenacting, Are there cases or incidents where, reenactors try to bring in Black reenactors or Black living historians to sort of do this fantasy fulfillment, whether, I've heard stories of female Black interpreters who there's visitors or reenactors who want to do, Gone with the Wind and sort of all these things that they saw as kids, or have, whether have that the Black Confederate or the happy slave, similar to Gods in General.
Oh yeah,
old Sam, I think.
Yeah. So yes to all of that. And I don't think it stops with reenactors. I used to work again at the Atlanta History Center, and they managed the Margaret Mitchell House, where she wrote most of Gone with the Wind. And obviously, the people that are interpreting there, we weren't in period attire or costume; we were in regular clothes. But I remember being on a tour one day, and this man heckled me the entire time. The tour may have been like a 30-minute tour, something like that. And from start to finish, periodically, he would yell out, "I don't know nothing about birth and no baby." Like that was a little punchline. And I let him kind of get away with it until the end. And at the end, I said, "So I talked about lost cause mythology and Margaret Mitchell and the civil rights movement, how this all plays into today." And I said, "Sir, what is your name? You've been so helpful with this demonstration." And he told me his name. Let's say the name is Jim. So I'm like, "Thank you, Jim." I said, "This entire time you've been quoting this Gone with the Wind." I said, "This is a great example of people taking something that was pretty much a racist movie, and that's promoting white supremacy, whether it is intentionally or unintentional. This is what it did, and popularizing it, making it people think that this is okay to promote minstrelsy." And we talked about the idea of minstrelsy and how this kind of comical nature of these or the portrayal of comical nature of enslaved people as kind of not really fully human, of childlike, trickles into today and kind of shut the man down. And he was like, "Oh my God, I never really think about that." And it's like, yes, we, no matter what race we are, we are consuming information, and that informs how we engage the world, for positive, for good, or for ill. Now, when it comes to reenactors, I've been invited to plenty of events. Some events I participated in especially when I was younger, and just wanted to be. You probably read that from my blog post I wrote. But I would jump at any instance. If a person I thought was a friend invited me to a cool event, I would go. I would dress up as their enslaved person. I would, whatever the impression was, I would probably do. And then as I got older, I noticed these people are not my friends. You're using me. There's a guy, I will not say, even though he deserves to be called out, I will not use his name. But there's a gentleman, there's a guy that I used to reenact with. He lives in Georgia, I believe. Military U.S. Army officer, who enjoys using the N-word in period, to be period correct, in quotes. We were at an event called "To Prevent the Infusion of Blood" in Charleston, South Carolina. It was supposed to be the federal soldiers leaving Fort Moultrie in Charleston Harbor and occupying Fort Sumter before the South Carolina militia attacked Fort Sumter at the beginning of the Civil War. And the scenario was the civilians like myself were supposed to be building the Fort Sumter. There's white and black civilians. Well, I was only black civilian, but the white civilians and I, we kind of gather on the dock as this boat is pulling up, and we're supposed to be either greeting the soldiers or booing them. And the soldiers start marching through. I start cheering as a black man. I'm like, "Yay, these federal soldiers are here to make sure these rebels don't get too out of hand." And then he starts yelling just the N-word at me. This was not scripted. And afterwards he was like, "Oh, that was a really cool, a really cool, first person moment we had there." And I was like, "No, it's not." And I told him, I was like, he was like, "Oh, I told him it's not appropriate to use the N-word, almost under any circumstance, unless you were quoting a letter, from someone, because these are their words, not yours." And he was like, "Well, I was trying to get into the moment. We are 21st century people. There are other things we need to work on before you get into to using racist language. I could throw out a lot of 19th century words that you would not know that would be common in the 19th century for people. So unless you know like just basic vocabulary, why are you going to the London denomination? You're just using this to use a word that you can't use in your regular life. That you're now like, why would you want to? Like, I have no desire to use offensive language towards white people or Asian people like that. Like, that's not something that's in me. Ta-Nehisi Coates was asked a question about white people using the N-word in like rap, like if they want to sing along, and his answer was amazing. He says that he talks about that if there are that words have meaning depending on the context of the situation. He talks about if you're walking down the street with your wife, and you might call your wife honey, or your wife might call you honey, or your partner might call you honey. But if a stranger walks up to you and calls you honey, there's probably going to be a problem, because in context, out of context, like, that person should not be calling you honey unless they know you, and it's okay for them to be calling you honey. But a strange person walking up and saying, "Hey, honey," that seems out of place. The same thing with the N. And so there are words that can be used amongst Black people because we own those words, and there's also words that can be used amongst different other ethnic groups and racial groups that they may find appropriate, that are not necessarily appropriate for the broader public. And I think because white people have not really been told no ever in society, outside of like 1865, when it was like, okay, you can no longer own people. It's hard for white people to hear the term no, like to hear no, in my opinion. Especially like, you can't do something because history has been made up of you've been able to literally do anything you want. Invading a native lands, no repercussion. Invading other countries, no repercussion. And so so when you're told, like, I want to be part of the fun too, I want to sing the lyrics, it does become confusing when you've never been told no before. I'm talking in a broad scale. No, individuals have been told no by their face and stuff, or by their teachers. And so I do think that that guy is a good snapshot of people wanting to live out their fantasy of being able to say things or do things that would not be socially acceptable in the 21st century. Even if it's a first-person immersive reenactment, which I do enjoy immersive events. I don't enjoy them for the language that's used, but for trying to get as much into the time period as possible to see what it'd be like to work on and get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and go to sleep when it's dark. I find enjoyment out of that, and doing the work that someone might do in the 19th century. But what's not enjoyable is the white supremacy, the racism, the sexism, all the phobias that existed then and also exist now, and people in the 21st century justify their own bigotry because as trying to be quote unquote authentic.
And speaking of the isms, but especially with Black living historians and female living historians, or other groups, it seems that the gatekeeping that has been going on in reenacting living history has, I would say, slightly diminished, where now Black living history interpreters and groups of female living history interpreters and reenactors are sort of able to come in on their own and sort of on their own terms. The women are no longer have to come in as just the wives or the girlfriends of a reenactor and dress up so they can hang out and portraying the wives of the officers, but that they bring in new interpretation. And then with the different groups that you work with, whether Black military or Black citizens or enslaved people, are now able to come in on their own. I mean, do you see that there's slightly less gatekeeping going on in the reenacting hobby and living history, or has the experience for you changed at all over the years or very recently?
I would say it really depends on the unit. I would say for our group, I'm part of an organization called the Sons and Daughters of Ham. And when we founded our group, we took our name from a Paul Laurence Dunbar quote or poem, where he says, "These noble colored soldiers, these noble sons of Ham." He's talking about the 54th and 55th Massachusetts, and so we took our name from that quote. But we wanted to be inclusive. We didn't want it to be the Sons of Ham. We wanted to say, hey, women are welcome in our organization because we're doing Black civilians during the Civil War. And so we named ourselves the Sons and Daughters of Ham. And I think we try to be as democratized as possible. So there's no one who's a president and vice president. Everyone is equal in the eyes of the organization. We all have an equal vote. We all have an equal say. We don't care what age you are, what abilities you have. We have people that are in their 60s all the way down to kids in their teens, like 12 or 13 or something like that. We have people who have disabilities and exceptionalities. Like one of our members has Down syndrome, but she's a vital member of our group. Her mom is white, and she's adopted, but she's just as much a part of the group as anyone else. And so she and her mom interpret disabilities and help us tell that broader story. I don't think very many groups would be comfortable or open to, one, doing the research, and two, allowing someone who's nonverbal to participate. And our philosophy as part of the Sons and Daughters of Ham is, as long as you want to come out and as long as you want to interpret the history authentically and be respectful, that's our mission. I think social media has made living history and reenacting more democratized, because no longer do you have to enter through. Is like, oh, what group is in my area? That's the only group I can be part of. Now you can find, because when I started out, as a reenactor, it was the birth of the internet, and I remember finding a unit online. There was like one website for Black reenactors. There was a unit that was up in like Rhode Island or something, and I lived in Georgia at the time, Atlanta, and I called the guy to have him obviously return my phone call, and then he gave me the number of another guy in Atlanta who didn't have an email address. So I'd like keep calling, and the guy also didn't have a voicemail, so I just keep calling and I wound up with that Black Civil War reenacting, and that's how I got in. But now, like, most of our members come to us because, like, they'll find us on Instagram, they'll find us on Facebook, and then there's other people who are around the country who reach out to us and say, "Hey, how can I get started? You guys are too far for me to necessarily get involved with." And be like, "Hey, you know what? These are some tips of how to attract other people, especially people of color, how to start up a." These are often these are guidelines that we would suggest for authenticity. So I do think that living history and reenacting has become more open, especially I think with the protest over Black Lives against police brutality last summer. I think people are paying a lot more attention, and there's a lot. I think there's a lot more people who are interested in getting into living history because people are waking up now, saying, okay, that history that we thought we knew is not actually the history that we know. The history that we've been taught as kids is not actually the history. And so when we're out doing living histories, people are coming up to us, even if they don't necessarily want to dress up, like, wow, thank you for being out here. I see myself. I've been coming here for years, and I've never seen a Black reenactor. Or there was a guy, we were doing living history at Harper's Ferry, and I believe he was from Venezuela, and he was like, hey, like, is there a way that I can fit in? And I was like, well, I was like, let me do some research. Like, I don't know very much about Venezuelans and the United States colored troops, or with what we're doing contraband here with the contraband, but like, let's do some research together and find out how you can participate in living history or reenacting, whether it's with us or with another group, because we don't want to be crabs in a bucket, constantly pulling each other down. One of my favorite slogans from any civil rights movement comes from I think the Colored League of Women Voters, pretty much it was an African American suffrage organization in 1920s, and their slogan was "Lifting as we climb." So it wasn't about like, "Hey, we got voting rights. Now let's shut the door behind us." But as we advance, we want to make sure that we're bringing other people up with us. And so, as a Black American, I think it's our duty not to shut the door behind us when it comes to equality and who we're interpreting, at least the ethnic groups that we're interpreting, but making sure that other BIPOC people, queer people, women, any marginalized group can see themselves in that living history. And so, how can I make this this hobby, this workplace, how can I make that more inviting and acceptable, and a healthy place for others who don't see themselves in the historical.
And I think there's an argument to be made that a lot of reenactors tend to focus on military and militaria because it sort of allows to sort of plausible deniability as to why you may not know or not care about things like Black history. You don't have to talk about the causations of the Civil War or enslavement and the lives of enslaved people if you're only concerned with the battles and the armies and the movements and things like that. And so I totally do see that with these new portrayals, new groups, that it brings sort of a freshness to reenacting living history because it is things that people have probably not seen before. So I guess in going to events, especially events with other non-Black groups, how has these portrayals been received?
It's mixed. Sometimes people love it, sometimes people don't. But their discomfort is not my concern. My concern is educating the public. There's people who on the face, based on what they're wearing, I would assume they're probably not an ally of mine, but they've come up and asked really interesting questions. And my objective is not necessarily to change anyone's mind, it's to educate. So if that person is, I've never encountered anyone wearing a swastika, but like if a person walked up to me and they were wearing a swastika shirt and they had questions about African American participation in the Civil War, I would give them the same interpretation that I would a Black family coming up. Because my hope would be that they were walking away a little more educated than they came here with. And if I affected change in them and they're like, you know what, this swastika shirt is dumb, I need to burn this and get out of whatever organization I'm part of, then great. I'm happy that that I was part of that change. And if it just started that one little crack that eventually in 30 years they decide, hey, you know what, I've been learning so much, or I want to read more, then that's also great. And if they just got the information, were interested and left and went back about their daily lives, that's also cool. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. So my interest is not in pleasing other reenactors or other living historians. It's about educating the public. So I would say, and I would definitely put the Sons and Daughters of Ham. We do have a military wing, the Hannibal Guards. I would definitely put our groups up against any other group in terms of history, being able to interpret the broader Civil War. Because not only, like you said, do groups often typically focus on the military side, people often forget the civilian side of what was going on. But you can't understand the Civil War without understanding the politics. You can't understand the Civil War without understanding what was going on before the Civil War. So you have to really have a context for American history that's just looking at World War II and saying, well, like the Japanese just like bombed Pearl Harbor for no reason. Like, I don't understand World War II. It was like they attacked, and then you just stop at 1945. You're like, okay, we're all good now. But no, you have to connect the dots. The Cold War started afterwards, and before that, you had World War One, and then you have to understand why, like World War One ending, and the rise of communism, the rise of fascism, and these competing ideologies. So nothing happens in a vacuum, and I think, unfortunately, when you focus on just the battles and the tactics and who shot John behind the tree, you're kind of navel gazing and you're looking myopically at something that the general public doesn't care about, which I think is why most people like don't become interested in history until they get older, because we teach in the classrooms history from a very Gettysburg was important because it was the bloodiest battle of the American Civil War, lasted 3 days, 1863, July 1st through July 3rd. You should know this because, and Abraham Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address after. That tells you nothing, absolutely nothing about the Civil War. Outside, there was a battle, and Abraham Lincoln gave a speech.
Yeah. I mean, it's great for pub trivia, but it's not, history. And I mean, to bring it back to the Black experience, even when I was in school, we covered the Civil War, even in grade school and high school. We may have covered it in a day or two. And, the Battle of Gettysburg, they don't talk about enslaved people building fortifications or the kidnapping of free Black people of Pennsylvania by the retreating army and the connection, the bigger cultural connection.
Yeah, that's actually one. Before we formed the Sons and Daughters of Mayhem, the core group of us that wound up forming it, we wound up we actually portrayed that did that portrayal of African Americans in the town of Gettysburg who had to flee to escape the advancing Confederates. And visitors came and they're like, "Oh, look, we didn't know there was Black people in Gettysburg." We got to tell this really rich history. And so why is there not a large Black population in Gettysburg today? Because in 1863, the Confederates literally marched into town and rounded people up and sold people into enslavement, whether they were born enslaved or born free. They didn't care. There was no rule of law. And so being able to expose people to that history that is uncomfortable for some, it can be problematic if you're trying to promote a certain ideology, a lost cause ideology of history. If you want to glorify Robert E. Lee, there's no glory in sending your troops into a town to seize people and sell them into enslavement. It's not like these people were combatants. They didn't lose a battle. They were baking bread, marched in their house, and then sold them. And so I think that portrayal made some people uncomfortable, like you asked in your earlier your earlier question. But again, I think that our presence at sites as Black living historians, reenactors, it should cause people to think. It should cause some cognitive dissonance. Why haven't I not seen this? If you see a reenactment, if you see a historic film and you do not see Black and brown bodies, definitely when it comes to the Civil War or the American Revolution on both sides, and you don't see a large number of Black and brown bodies on both sides, it's not accurate. African Americans were the backbone of the Confederate Army and the Union Army as well. They were the backbone of the Continental Army and definitely the British Army. A lot of the stuff that we think of today being done by civil engineers and the quartermaster corps, like laborers and stuff, the Seabees today would have been done. Those ideas of roads, building trenches, like you said, building earthworks, fortifications. Much of that, not all, but much that was done by enslaved labor or free people who were impressed into service. And you just don't see that represented in films, in movies, in history books, in reenactments. And why? Because people don't know the research. They haven't done the research because we were able to look at history with our blinders on and say, if it's not a battle, I don't care about it. But who fed your army? Who drove the wagon? Who drove the wagons that supplied your ammo? Who's cooking for you? Who's butchering the meat? Who's driving the cattle from one place to the other so it can be? If you guys are on a ship, who are the dock hands that are unloading and loading the ship? Who are the people who are working on the ship? Not all of them will be Black people, but I guarantee you, the majority in the South are going to be Black, if not exclusively all of them. And so if you're not asking those questions, then you're not interpreting history correctly.
And talking about authenticity and doing history, as a public policy scholar, I'm a political show junkie. I watch any show about politics, I'll watch. And so there was a line by Joe Morton the actor Joe Morton in the show Scandal, where he said a variation of the popular Black proverb. He said, "You got to be twice as good to get half of what they have." And so, do you feel that's the same with being a living history interpreter compared to, say, white reenactors or?
I think initially, yes. I think a lot of finances come into play and also knowledge. A lot of Black reenactors, the majority of Black reenactors today, are older Black men who either were of that glory generation, not necessarily they were in glory, but they would have when they were obviously much younger when Glory came out. And so they were definitely inspired by the movie Glory, whether they are whether they got into it back in I think '89 or like the '80s, '90s, or if they're getting into it now, but still kind of have that harkening back to those days. A lot of those gentlemen, unfortunately, don't have the knowledge base of what to like the good kit to wear, of where to get your like authentic reenacting accoutrements and attire. And I think that gatekeeping, like you talked about, I think it comes more into place when it comes to less so when it comes to race and gender, but more so when it comes to authentic versus mainstream. And for those who are listening who don't know the difference, there's a section of most reenactors that you see when you go to any battlefield. If you see a reenactor, if you see a film, those are what you call mainstream reenactors. People who you can pretty much get your reenacting gear like the Walmart of reenacting. There's lots of different people called sutlers who sell reenacting gear. Most of the stuff is made in Pakistan or Taiwan. It's accurate enough, meaning if you don't know what you're looking at, if you don't know what the cloth should feel like, and you're a layperson, you'll be like, oh, it looks like a Civil War soldier. But if you compare what they're wearing to original garment, you'll notice the construction is different. The fabric is different. There's nothing about it that would read, this is what a Civil War soldier would wear if you compared it to an original. On the other side of the hobby, a much smaller group is called people that are called campaigners or authentic reenactors. Sometimes they're called authentic campaigners or progressives. And those individuals usually have studied a lot more of that material culture, and they have cultivated relationships with sutlers that specifically produce high-end reenacting attire, historical accoutrement, and clothing. And so I do think there is some gatekeeping there, where authentic people usually only associate with authentic. There's very little like, hey, we need to go and try to encourage more people. And this is from my personal experience. I can't speak for all. But from my experience, there's very little trying to cultivate relationships with mainstream groups to try to bring people along. And it's not for everyone, again. But I think that gatekeeping keeps people who might want to do better from doing better. And from an African American standpoint, African Americans on average, make far less than our white counterparts. And so we have to understand that the reenacting living history, that is a privilege for middle class people. I don't know very many people who are like impoverished that are doing living history reenacting, because you have to have money. You have to have some kind of income to do this, or have some kind of financial backing.
And I agree. It's definitely a financial and time commitment.
Oh yeah, and if you don't have a car, if you don't have, and so how do you make it accessible to people of color who may not have a car, who may have to work on the weekends, who may have a sick family member, like who may not be able to afford this gear, whether it's the mainstream stuff or the high-end gear. How can you make that more affordable? And so I think that is the question that needs to be answered by all living historians, is that idea of accessibility. Again, our group, the Sons, Daughters of Ham, we try to make it as accessible as possible. Some of our members haven't bought anything. Like, well, maybe they may have bought one or two things, but for the most part, we try to, if we find stuff that like we have other actors donating stuff, like, hey, I'm getting out of the hobby, or hey, I outgrew this. It's a high quality piece, or it's not really high quality, but you guys can use it. And we'll find ways to use it, to cannibalize it, to make it into something different, sell it, to buy something newer for one of our new people. because we know that African Americans getting into the hobby don't have necessarily expendable income. Oprah, unfortunately, Oprah is not joining our group to say, "Hey, I'm going to sponsor you." And so how do you encourage more participation for Black people, or people of color in general? I think it's really making it as financially accessible as possible. It's not. I don't think we'll ever get there. Again, people have to work on the weekend nature, but what we do is we actually, one of our members, he makes amazing clothes, and so his thing is he'll okay, I'll take you out to the fabric store. We'll find you some fabric. If you have the money, you can pay for it. If not, we'll get some donations, figure out a way to pay for that fabric, and he'll make your kit for free. As long as you're getting that fabric and the buttons, like, you're good. And again, I don't think there's very many other organizations out there that are that committed to making sure that accessibility is a way in. Because again, even if you only try it out once and you're like, hey, you know what, this wasn't for me, cool. You know what, you tried it. We're going to keep your clothes now so we can outfit the next person. But like, we don't mind trying, like, taking a chance on someone and letting people try it out, because you don't know if how it's going to go until you try it. But I do think that, because there is a lot of criticism for Black military reenactors of like, well, they don't look that great. It would be great if you guys could, like, if there was a company of authentic Black reenactors. That's fine and dandy. I think like some of their interpretation is better than the white guy's interpretation. So what you look like physically doesn't mean you're necessarily a bad interpreter. But I do think when it comes to the physical representation, some of these some Black reenactors do have to be twice as good to be considered half as good. I think I'm to a point in my career, because I'm both I do living history and also work in the museum field. Again, I'm still learning. There's not a lot of people that challenge me. I do enjoy people to challenge, because that makes me hit the books again. My mentee and little brother, Hugh Goffinet, USCT trooper on Instagram, we're always battling and going at it when it comes to primary sources and what's authentic and what's not. When it comes to Civil War, World War I, World War II, Spanish Civil War, you name it, we're always challenging each other, because that makes us, I think, stronger.
And I mean, I've seen many of your portrayals. You kind of cover sort of a myriad of Black history, everything from Revolutionary War, Civil War. I've seen your World War One. I believe you did a Black abolitionist from New York. Yep. I think I've seen that one on Living History. So I always ask living historians and reenactors on the show, so when you start a new portrayal, what's your process for doing that?
So I first start by doing the research. I want to know everything about that time period that especially the politics, what's going on politically, what is going on. So a kit that I'm always trying to improve on, one of my favorite time periods is World War I. Not necessarily the battle stuff, I really don't care that much about. But what I do find interesting is it's the Jim Crow Army under the first president to pretty much segregate the U.S. Government since the Civil War. Woodrow Wilson. You have the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, the beginning of the new Negro movement, the new women's movement. You have all this kind of confluence of everything going on in the United States, and then you also have this war going on the other side of the pond. And why would Black Americans serve that doesn't love them? Lynchings are on the rise. Congress doesn't want to pass the anti-lynching bill. And then looking at the primary sources, looking at the writings of Marcus Garvey and the newspapers from the Universal Negro Improvement Association, looking at the writings of W.E.B. Du Bois, looking at the writings of Booker T. Washington, and trying to find out from a Black perspective, what are these things that Black people are debating at this time? What are the why would Black people be involved in the conflict or not involved in it? And then also, what are white people? There's apprehension about immigrants from Europe, people who speak strange languages, people who have strange religions, like people who are Catholic or Jews invading the United States. This caused a lot of hesitancy and angst in the United States. America being a police state at that point in time, passing all kind of laws about against anti-German legislation. I think so. Researching this idea of what America looked like at that time, that taking a snapshot of that era, and saying, what did this look like? Why, if I'm going to portray this, this impression, who am I representing? Why am I doing this? What did America look like this time? Is this interesting time to? How is it relevant to today? That's, I think, my key with all interpretation is how do I connect this time period to the 21st century, to whatever year we're living in. And World War I think, is a perfect example. Today, since the election of Barack Obama, we've seen an uptick in the rise of white supremacy and white nationalism, not just within the United States, but across the world. Definitely since the financial crash took place. And so there are a lot of really interesting comparisons, not saying things are exactly the same, but comparisons between what's happening in the 19-teens, 1920s, and what's happening today in our lives. When 9/11 happened, I remember people talking about putting Muslims on registries and rounding Muslims up, Muslim Americans. And that horrified me as a Black American, because if it can happen to our Muslim brothers and sisters, it sure as hell could happen to me as a Black American. America has traditionally not cared about Black people. And so looking back at World War I, saying, no, there was a precedent for this, of rounding Germans up and saying, you look suspicious, or you can't live in this neighborhood because it's too close to a munitions factory. We're going to put you on a government watch list, unbeknownst to you, or you have to register because you're a foreign alien, or whatever the situation. And then also understanding the aftermath of these conflicts. The issues going on in Russia today with the United States and Russia can be traced back to the failed policies of World War I. The issues, the Vietnam War can trace its start back to World War I, where Ho Chi Minh tried to meet with Woodrow Wilson, and Wilson wouldn't even listen to him. So really, my process is really looking at the documents, looking at the history, the culture, what's going on, and then starting to move into that material culture side of what do I need to look like. But it starts off with that reason.
I follow a number of reenactors and living historians who do things outside of American history. They do. There's been a number of Black living historians starting to do medieval, because going back to what we're talking about, this sort of vision of the world as sort of this all white sort of place, but we do have evidence of Black people living in medieval Europe at the time, and so we're starting to see people doing that. And so, did you ever consider doing anything outside of America, or do you consider yourself just a pure Americanist when it comes to doing reenacting, or have you ever thought about sort of spreading your portrayals?
I focus primarily on the Black American experience. Like, I do Spanish Civil War reenacting, which I still portray an American going over to Spain. I've been developing a Haitian Revolution portrayal, but that's still in the Americas, obviously. I have thought about doing a North African soldier or civilian for the kind of the Middle Ages. I think because for me that shows like really one of the many high points in world history, but definitely in African history. The thinking about like people like Mansa Musa, who to this day is the wealthiest person in all of world history. Jeff Bezos had nothing on it. And highlighting that the greatness of these African empires that existed when Europeans were illiterate, were dying of the Black Plague. This idea of like the Dark Ages, they weren't only dark, really. So I've really considered doing an African impression for those Middle Ages to really highlight like we often talk about the Dark Ages and the Crusades, but there were other cultures out here who were preserving history and culture. Much of the culture, the ancient culture and history we do have today was preserved from Muslim scholars who when they captured Spain and parts of France and parts of Italy and things of that nature, they took these manuscripts, they translated them, and they kept them until obviously they were kicked out, and then these other governments came in and have them now. And so I have thought really about expanding, but as we just discussed, living history and reenacting can be quite expensive, and so
Right.
investing a lot of money into armor and clothing that I may wear once a year or once every couple of years becomes less appealing.
Right. It's something you like really have to do. I usually try to keep my portrayals down to like 3, maybe 4, because of the amount of investment and the time just alone. And with New England, we've seen an uptick in timeline events.
Oh yeah.
And 3 different groups I'm with all do the same event, and so now I have to like, well, which kit do I invest in, and which child is the rotten child that I don't want to talk to. But you did talk a little bit about the next generation of Black reenactors and living historians. So would you have any message of inspiration or any tips to get sort of that new generation of Black reenactors started, or to inspire them?
What better way to honor your ancestors than to tell their story? I find pride in, it's not always comfortable, but I think the more you wear the clothes, I think the more comfortable it gets. And I think actually historical clothes are sometimes more comfortable than modern clothes, personally. But I would say that what better way to honor your ancestors than to tell their story? Your people who you may not even know their names, you will probably never see their faces, but they're always with you. What better way to honor them, to honor their legacy, than to tell their stories in the now? Also, advice would be find a group that fits your needs. Don't be pigeonholed by, hey, this is the only group in my area. Start a group. If you have friends who are thinking about getting into it, or if you don't, there are other people who are like you who want to get into it. Reach out to us, and we may not be in your area, the Sons and Daughters of Ham or the Hannibal Guards, but we probably know other Black people in your area who are interested. And really try to carve out a safe place for you. Because when I started, I did not go through a lot of trauma because of some of the people I interacted with that I thought were friends. And there are members of our group who have similar stories, but there's also members of our group who, fortunately, we brought in fresh, and so they got to avoid those pitfalls. And that's something that I would always try to encourage people to do, is avoid the pitfalls that we made. Yes, right now your white buddy who you might want to go out and take the field with as a Confederate or a Union soldier, it may seem fun right now, but I guarantee you, as you grow older, as you mature, some of those experiences you may be feeling comfortable, not necessarily from your buddy, but the people that they surround themselves. And unless you speak up and say something, unless your buddy speaks something, you may continuously put yourself in these traumatic situations. So making sure that you are joining a unit or an organization that is healthy, that loves you for you, that doesn't want you to be the token, that doesn't try to make you do anything that would put you in a space to be physically harmed or emotionally. And so that's the advice that I give, is join a group that celebrates you and really wants to celebrate your ancestors, and allows you to be the teller of your truth and your story.
And would you have any messages or sort of, I guess, commentary to event coordinators or those planning to put on an event, how to be more inclusive, or how to, I guess, be better?
Yeah, I think looking around your organization, whether it's a museum, a historic site, a county park, or college campus, looking around your institution and looking at who's not at the table, who doesn't look like you, or who looks like you, and how many people don't look like you. And we're not just talking about men and women, but all races. Yes, you may have a lot of Black people in maintenance, but what does it look like on people on your level? What does the board look like? What does the upper management look like? The vice presidents and CEO and directors and managers. How diverse are those? Is that cool? And yes, you may have a handful of people of color in higher places. But what is your visitation? What stories are you telling at your site? It's not enough to do a program for Black History Month and do your check, and Women's History Month, check, Native American Month, check, Asian American History Month, check. But how are you infusing these stories into the day-to-day operation? How are you bringing in and recruiting new staff, new board members, people who have these varying different perspectives and views that are going to challenge you? And challenging doesn't necessarily mean it may be uncomfortable, but that challenging you would help you grow. I had a math teacher, Miss DeMello, who I was not fond of for a very long time. Miss DeMello, I love you now. But if she's listening, but Miss DeMello, she was a hard teacher. She challenged us. I'm not a math kid, and she challenged us. And she refused to let us fail as students. She's like, the only person who's going to fail is going to be yourself. You're not going to fail. Like, if I'm your tutor, if I'm your teacher, you're going to sit here and I'll call your parents and be like, he's coming, like, he's not coming home yet because he hasn't finished his homework. And I think that hard love of board members, of Black and brown and BIPOC interpreters and contractors you may bring in, listen to people. We know our own experiences. Not saying that every contract you bring in is going to be phenomenal, but do your research. Try to find people who are going to challenge you, who are not just going to be a yes person and say, yep, what you're doing is fine. Or they're going to try to challenge you and be like, hey, this is what I would recommend you do. And then also look at your staff. You may have people there who are great at what they do, but challenge your staff to do more, to do better. How can they be more? Not saying you're not going to be able to change overnight. It's you're doing a marathon, you're not doing a sprint. But being intentional with the steps you are taking, being deliberate. So don't drag your feet and say, okay, we're doing a marathon, so I can wait for 10 years to think about hiring a Black employee. Well, no, okay, we know this is what we need to do. We know we need to diversify our staff. We know that we live out in the West, and we need to have more American Indian interpreters. So how do you do that? Is it reaching out to and developing, cultivating relationships? It's not going to be just you put your ad in the local newspaper or online and hope people apply. But no, developing and cultivating relationships in the community, the communities that you live in the communities that you want to develop relationships with. And community relations building takes time. It takes decades, years before you can see sometimes the fulfillment of what you've tried to do. And so it's going to take patience. It's going to take you hearing no. It might take people saying, like, I don't trust you. And you being willing to say, okay, people don't trust me. Why? Is looking at the history of your organization. Has your organization always been equitable? You may not be a white supremacist, but are you working for an organization that has promoted white supremacy in some way, shape, or form? And so that's really the advice is challenge yourself, bring in people to do trainings for you and your staff about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Bring in people to train yourself on living history, on how to interpret, and not a one-time, constantly training. Because just like any sport, you're exercising a muscle. Interpreting is a muscle. If you don't use it, you lose it. Trust me, I know. The pandemic has been awful on me when it comes to engaging with the public because I'm not able to do it as much as I once was. And so it's really important to train your staff and keep training them with updated trainings and management as well on how to interpret, how to do how to put on a public program, what public programs, working with community members to find out what public programs they want to see that would be the most impactful.
And I think before we sign off, was there anything that you wanted to sort of plug or promote?
Let's see. I'm terrible at promotion, but again, I'll say for those who want to look into us and find out what we're doing, definitely you can find the Sons and Daughters of Ham on Facebook, as well as the Hannibal Guards. The Hannibal Guards is our military wing. The Sons and Daughters of Ham is our civilian wing. If you are interested in learning more about how to get involved, you can always reach out to me. You can contact me. The easiest way is through Instagram or on Facebook. You can find me on both at MAG, that stands for Marvin-Alonzo Greer, but MAG, the historian. And again, you can find me on Instagram or on Facebook. Send me a message. I'll try to get back to you. Instagram, I'll probably get back to you a little bit faster. I'm trying to wean myself off of Facebook, but not owned by the same company. However, if you anything people anytime I can help someone, I usually try. So that would be my advice and what I would like to plug.
Thanks a lot, and I hope to someday that we get the Sons and Daughter of Ham and the Hannibal Guard up in New England.
We would love
to drive from DC.
We would love to be up there sometime. Just let us know when we can try to arrange something.
Excellent, and thanks for taking time to be on the podcast today, and totally appreciate it.
Thank you, Michael, for having me.
That's it for our show today. Thanks to all of our guests, and thanks to everyone listening. This is Deconstructing History.